hope that today's project is an inspiring one. This will be the 5th video where I've been pioneering some new wall panel decorations, despite having done this project a few times before. If you would like to check out those other videos, they can be found here, here, and here. I'm ready to get to work, and I have no doubt that everything will turn out perfect. Today, I'm going to use some pie tins and some clay to make some pie splat wall panel decorations. Oh, no. I'm not going to use this pie tin, but rather these 2 small pie tins to make some mini pie splats to go along with the others that I've made previously. A while back I went to a festival and bought a mini pie from one of the vendors. When I saw that it came in this mini pie tin, I knew that I had to turn it into another pie splat project. As you can see, it's quite a bit smaller than a standard size pie tin. This slightly bigger one I actually found online. It's a pretty good intermediate size between the small pie tin and the full-sized one. To make these molds, I'm going to sculpt them onto this sheet of melamine. The reason for using the melamine is that the silicone that I use for the mold and the hot glue that I use to make the mold box won't stick to it. I'm going to start by tracing out the shape of the pie tin onto the melamine with a pencil and drawing lines that I will use as guides for the splat sculpture. For a project like this one, I found that it's more efficient to make a sketch of what is going to be sculpted before starting work with the clay. Having a sketch to follow means that less time will be spent backtracking, and the sculpture will be started with a better idea of what the end result will be. With the sketch done, I can finally start sculpting. When working with the clay, I really tried to capture a sense of motion or movement from when these tiny pies slammed into the wall at a high velocity. I also tried to add a bit of depth so that the sculpt wouldn't look like it was just a flat decoration that might as well have been painted on instead of sculpted. The clay that I'm using is basic water-based clay from Michaels. I started with placing the clay underneath where the pie tin goes because it needs to have a proper seal. If there are any gaps, the molding silicone will leak into the space under the pie tin and be wasted. After having made a few different versions of this particular project, I think that I'm getting really good at sculpting this splat shape. Another thing that I find interesting is being able to revisit a similar project to see how I progressed as far as recording and editing videos goes. Hopefully, in the past few years since I made my first pie splat video, I've improved at making a more entertaining video that showcases my work. To keep this little pie tin from caving in on itself, I hot glued a piece of styrofoam into the inside of the tin. I then used a little bit of clay to smooth out the holes that were punched into the tin from the vendor who originally made the mini pie. Or at least I tried my best to fill them in. Clay doesn't really like to stick to anything when it's that thin. Now that the sculpture is completed, I can start assembling the walls for the mold. I'm drawing lines between the points that stick out the furthest in an attempt to use less molding silicone. I use this piece of styrofoam to gauge the height of the sculpture, and then I add a ½ inch to that to get the full height for the mold walls. When making a mold box, it's best to keep a minimum of a ½ inch clearance between the edge of the sculpture and what will be the outside edge of the mold. Any less, and the walls of the mold will be too thin, which would run the risk of having the mold produce deformed castings later on down the line. Next, I cut a sheet of 3/4 inch styrofoam into strips that are the correct size for the height of the walls of the mold box. I then cut the strips to fit between the guidelines that I drew on the board. With the strips cut to length, I then used hot glue along the bottom to secure them to the melamine. Once the hot glue had cooled, I sealed the gaps between the strips with more hot glue. When sealing the box for the mold, it is very important to make sure that it is completely sealed. The silicone is very sneaky and never to be trusted with your deceased loved one's ashes. Oh, and it'll also leak out anywhere it can, so be vigilant. For those of you who are watching this entire video, humor me and make a comment about the joke that I just made, so that people who just skip to the reveal at the end of the video will be super confused about what everyone is talking about. For this pie splat, I'll be using Mold Max 30 from Smooth On, and I'll be mixing up 2 separate batches. That way, I can gauge how much silicone to mix and I won't end up mixing more than what I need. Also, I'm not sponsored by Smooth-On, it's just what I'm using. As always, I gotta take a moment to show that sweet silicone mixing action. When mixing, I make sure to mix everything thoroughly, making sure that I scrape the sides and bottom of the container. Since I don't have a vacuum chamber to degas my silicone before pouring it, I've had to come up with a different way to minimize having bubbles in my molds. A method that I've found that works well for me is that I pour a small amount of silicone on the high points of my sculpture and allow the silicone to be pulled and stretched thin by gravity. As far as mold making goes, only the layer in contact with the mold subject needs to be bubble free. The rest of the silicone in a mold like this can be a little less than perfect. With the first batch of silicone poured, I can mix up a second, smaller batch to fill it up to the top of the mold box walls. After letting the silicone cure overnight, it's time to demold this sucker and see how it turned out. Well, it looks like it turned out great, and the bits of clay from the splat popped right out. Since the clay popped out so cleanly, I'm going to set them aside and use them to make the other Mini Pie Splat. Before I get started on sculpting the second Pie Splat, I'd like to share this footage of the first time that the stray kitty that lives outside my shop trusted me enough to climb up and sit on my lap. While she's baking biscuits out of my nether regions, I'll take this moment to mention my Patreon. Silicone for making molds is expensive, and I have many ideas for much bigger and better projects. So if you liked this video or found it or any of my other videos helpful or inspirational, and you'd like to support me to see where my imagination and building skills will take me, please consider contributing. The link is in the description. Before I get to making some castings with the first mold, I'm going to go ahead and start work with a little bit bigger pie tin. Just like before, I trace out the shape of the pie tin, draw some guides, and sketch out what I want to sculpt. As mentioned before, I saved some parts from the first Pie Splat, and I'm going to reuse them here to save some time sculpting and save some materials. With the sketch done, I can start sculpting. So the reason that I'm making these mini pie splats when I already have several molds of full-size pie splats is because I want to use these to make a forced perspective effect in my haunt. Basically, I place the full-size pie splats on the walls, down at eye level or lower, close to where the guests will be. They'll work as a size reference. That way, when I place the mini pie splats at the tops of the panels or on something that's supposed to appear to be further away, it'll give an effect of something being taller or further in the distance than it really is. With the splat sculpture done, I can firmly press the pie tin down into the clay. Now that the sculpture is finished, I draw lines where the walls for the mold box will go, cut the strips of styrofoam to the required height, and glue them into place with the hot glue. I'm just curious, do these splats remind anybody else of like old school Nickelodeon or anything like that, or is it just me? With the mold box finished, I can start mixing up my first batch of silicone. This mold is going to require me to mix 3 different batches of silicone. This first batch will be the same as the first batch on the other mini pie splat. It'll be just enough to pour some silicone on the high spots and allow gravity to stretch the silicone out so thin that any of the major bubbles that would be against the sculpture will have to pop. Once the bubbles have had time to pop, I pour the remaining silicone and let it fully cure overnight. Now that the first batch of silicone is fully cured, I mix up a second batch of silicone, and since this is just a filler layer, I mix in some chopped up bits of old silicone. That way the old stuff doesn't go to waste, and I don't have to mix up quite as much new silicone to fill in this area at the top of the mold that is mostly just empty space. I also make sure to mix in the chopped up bits with the fresh silicone really well so that everything is completely covered. After I mixed everything together very thoroughly, I slop it onto the top of the mold and smooth everything out so that nothing is sticking up above the mold wall. After I get everything smoothed out to where I like it, I let this batch cure overnight. With the filler layer of silicone fully cured, I can mix up my third and final batch of silicone for this project. This batch is just to smooth out and fill in the rough surface of the previous layer. When I make castings with this mold, it will be laying with this side face down, so I need to make a flat surface for it to lay on. After letting the silicone cure overnight, it's time to demold this thing and see how it turned out. It looks like I got another winner on my hands because it turned out great. Also, the pie tin popped out almost completely undamaged, so that's a plus. With the molds done, it's time to clean out any of the remaining clay residue. I just used a little bit of dish soap, a toothbrush, my fingernail, and some elbow grease, and eventually they're all cleaned out. It also doesn't hurt to let them soak in some warm water first to get the clay to loosen up. The small one is all clean, time to tackle the big one. With both molds clean, it's time to make a couple of castings. For this, I'll be using Foam at 8 from Smooth On. It's a good dense expansion foam that has a 2:1 mixing ratio by weight. So for every 1 ounce that I pour of part B, I have to pour 2 ounces of part A. Since it's such a dense expansion foam, it's durable enough that I don't have to hard coat the inside of the mold first. I cover it with some styrofoam and some weights. This will create back pressure in the mold, and the expansion foam will push off of the styrofoam and back into the mold and fill those finer details. After a few hours of letting the expansion foam solidify, I put the first mold aside and mix up a second batch for the other mold. When pouring the expansion foam into the mold, I make sure to coat all of the fine details. And there they are. They're just so mini. I'm super happy to add these to my collection of splattered food molds. Please forgive that I didn't include painting the castings in this video. I covered that in my previous Cupcake Splat videos, so I didn't feel like I should make this video any longer than it needed to be. I do have an upcoming video planned to use all of my Cupcake and Pie Splat molds to make a special set of wall panels, so be on the lookout for that coming up soon. If anyone would be interested in having me make some Pie Splats or Cupcake Splats to use in your haunt, feel free to reach out. Or check the description for a link to an online store. Additionally, if you liked this and are just wondering how to support my creativity, please consider contributing to my Patreon. The link is in the description. Also, please check out my previous Pie Splat or Cupcake Splat videos and let me know if they're any better or worse than this video. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed this project, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.